Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I already gave you the indication that I am moderating the session by moderating the chair. That was the banter thrown to me by Suman Joshi. After listening to such enlightening and energizing sessions, I think there is very little left for us to really discuss. I think it is a very, very optimistic scenario that the very young entrepreneurs and the investors, the branders, the technology people have created. This topic of interest to all of us because it is trying to design a new model of financing in Nepal. COVID-19 MSME Fund Nepal has termed itself a blended model not involving the public sector equity. When the blended finance concept was originated, say about 8 years ago, it has 3 catchwords still circulated: additionality, concessionality, and missing middle. So I think in COVID-19 MSME Fund Nepal, all two elements, I think the additionality and concessionality in the form of non-collateral loans and interest-free, in most of the cases, incentive, contribute to that. When it comes to missing middle, I think the MSME fund has gone onto the left out down, I would say, not the middle. I would like to start with Mr. Suman Joshi about the very conceptualization and the applicability of the blended concept without involving the public sector. How did you conceptualize it? May I ask you, Mr. Joshi?
That's a very interesting question right off the bat. We thought we were going to get to that at the end of it, but I'll attempt to answer that anyway. The first lockdown happened, and lockdown was beginning to take a toll on our SMEs. They were shutting their shutters, laying off people. The private sector associations also announced pay cuts, stuff like that. So we realized that we had to intervene. One too much, having worked in the SME space for such a long time, we felt the need to intervene, and we got talking to STC, a few banks, FMO was already supporting us, and then we checked the pulse of the SMEs and waited for a bit, but we saw nothing coming from the government side. There was no relief announced by the government. So we had to innovate, we had to think and get smart. So we went to the banks and asked them if they would be prepared to lend, if they were incentivized to do that. We hadn't sorted out what the incentives would be. We knew that they would ask for some risk mitigation, but then we were trying to look at other ways of getting there. So we got a positive response from a few banks early on, and then we went back to SCC and put it together, and we got the design sorted. And then we reached back out to the SMEs and said, well, do you guys have a bounce back plan? Have a bounce back plan, we'll travel, because we have these partners who are willing to support you. So we put it together, and as soon as we launched it, we actually went back to Nepal Rashtra Bank to basically make them aware of what we're trying to do. We had a very meaningful session with the top brass of Nepal Rashtra Bank. We showcased what we're trying to do, and the response was very, very encouraging. They were so happy that a private sector actor was taking this initiative. In fact, they were somewhat embarrassed that the government hadn't done enough by then. So that's how it was conceived and designed, and then the rest is history, as they say.
Thank you. The apprehension you mentioned were exactly what I was trying to mention. Okay, Dr. Marco, your country has been a very long-standing development partner for Nepal, and obviously you represent public sector from your country. The conventional concept of blended finance is also the public partnership. Domestic public partnership is one of the key concepts, particularly under the concept developed by OECD. But in this new kind of model, you have not only participated. Would you like to shed some light on your idea of partnership, and how are you feeling about the outcomes of it?
I think for an initiative to qualify as a blended finance initiative, the participation of public sector actors is inevitable. But you have to ask yourself in the first place, do you really need blended finance, right? So blended finance mechanisms should always be subsidiary to the market, and they have to be used selectively if there is a problem. Now, the problem in this case was obviously a global pandemic, but also a mismatch of incentives for the different actors involved in this space, and consequentially a mismatch of demand for and supply of growth capital. And I think this project has delivered additionality in three ways. So firstly, financial additionality. So it has mobilized additional funds to support SME growth. But it has also delivered developmental additionality. For instance, the breathing space that was mentioned by Kritika earlier, it has prevented many enterprises from going out of business, and it has even created over 350 new jobs, as we just heard in the first presentation. And then thirdly, there is like a systemic additionality, I would say, namely what you just mentioned, different perceptions of collateral requirements or the absence thereof. Then also, working towards this ecosystem that was mentioned in the last panel, and then also creating an instance of the collaboration between an agency, a development cooperation agency such as ours, then a development finance institution, and the private sector. And so this is something that allows for institutional learning on the one hand, but then also on the other hand, something that could be replicated also in other instances. One more point. Okay. The local, i.e. Nepali public sector was not directly involved in this initiative, but I think this project really can act as an example and as a precedent for mobilizing blended finance to support SME growth in Nepal. And I think, the different spheres of government in Nepal are already using grant funding to work towards private sector development. And I think some of those initiatives could actually also use like blending with private capital to achieve three things: to mobilize more funds, in the first place, and secondly also to enlarge the pool of targeted enterprises, and thirdly also to facilitate some kind of dialogue and conversation between the public sector partners and private sector representatives about strategic and operational topics. And I think that's very fruitful.
Ms. Chandni, you have been private sector development expert in a way. So in Nepal, most of the SMEs are said to be failing because there is no culture of integrating business development services with the financing. And as Mark mentioned, we very often have only supply-side approach in financing, not considering what exactly are the problems on the demand side. But this scheme seems to have very effectively integrated that BDS. So how do you think, how effectively do you think this integration has been, and what kind of role can play in effectiveness of SMEs in Nepal?
I think the answer lies in your question. I think this model has integrated both supply and demand side. If we look at the numbers, the financing gap for SMEs in Nepal or MSMEs in Nepal is up to $3.6 million. So that's a huge financing gap, and not all of it actually can be financed from local commercial banks. So we're looking at a financing problem that I think is pretty large. I think we cannot, diminish its impact on the SME sector in Nepal. At the same time, however, the business development services also has a role to play. And from our panelists in the earlier session, I think we can see from most of their challenges that they had challenges both on the business development side as well as the financing side. I think a good model would be to look at integrating the two, and there are multiple ways in which we can do this. But I think business development services in Nepal, I think sometimes, or a lot of our development programs have separated the two, and I think it's very important that we integrate them. Because what business development services also do is de-risk financing, actually. So you'll see a lot of DFIs that work in LDCs work in a model where they do business development services that helps them de-risk their investments into these sectors. So I would say this model is definitely something that we need to look at for Nepal.
Now I would like to come to Mr. Dastidar, who is head of Standard Chartered Bank, who also has got substantial experience in financing SMEs, although he's not partner in this particular scheme, but looking from outside, you can have a more objective view, I guess. One of the problems in financing SMEs is the trust deficit and the apprehension about the recovery. And third is the ticket size. When you talk about SMEs, we never even think about in terms of millions. So that has been a traditional kind of thinking. But I think all those three kind of cocoons of thoughts have now broken, it seems. So what do you think they actually help banks to trust on this kind of projects even without collateral and any kind of other tangible fixed asset securities?
Firstly, just a context. Banks, again, conventionally are kind of, whether you call it handcuffed or binded between documentation, financials, and with that, I think any bank would want to go for MSME financing. Secondly is actually, there is a lot of attraction in financing MSMEs, especially given the intensity around capital allocation. The returns are much higher. We believe that the track record and the soundness of the book, especially from a debt perspective, is much better in the MSME space. The reason we are saying it is that impairment has been very benign in Nepal. Now we can argue, there are theories and there are other theories, but LI's impairment is very benign in Nepal. Very interesting point on collateralization. It's not an excuse. In fact, it links in very strongly with this opportunity on this topic. Is today collateralization comes through regulation, and that is exactly the point why regulations need to reform. I mean, today NRB's regulation require you to either get a personal guarantee or collateralization. And when these measures come in, accounting standards lead to lost loan provisions, which deters most BFIs. So the point I would make, sir, is that there is tremendous opportunity on risk participation, hence blended finance. If the regulations can be worked in a manner where, take Standard Chartered, we are an international bank. Our participation model cannot be the same as a local bank. But we want to participate in MSMEs. Now, where is the risk participation opportunity? So could it be a fund? Could it be a non-fund based kind of participation model with a multilateral spread over a 10-year tenor, which is very attractive? So I think it's a combination of regulations which need to change.
Let me come back to Chandni again. So when we talk about MSMEs, that the main problem of Nepal's SMEs is that Do you think they operate like a business actually, or they look like they operate like just for the operating sake? What is the problem converting them into the actual business proposition in terms of operations and in terms of modality?
Development programs have worked in this space and provided grants. And because of that, maybe what we haven't done is encouraged SMEs to have financial discipline. So maybe this is something that a blended finance structure can support. I don't know if we would like to say that SMEs in Nepal don't understand their financial responsibilities. I think they would. If you give them an investment, I think they would take it as an investment. If you give them a grant, they would take it as a grant. But what maybe is challenging for SMEs in Nepal is growth, I think. That's one of the challenges that they face. How do you grow from micro to small? How do you grow from small to medium? But in their own space, I think they operate as businesses.
Dr. Marco, by the name itself, COVID-19 Fund Nepal seems to be a crisis-induced idea. So when we think of long-term sustainability and long-term support from the institution like yours, how can we make it not a crisis-induced idea, but a permanent kind of arrangement that we continue to support our MSMEs and the entrepreneurs of a startup in the country? So, what lesson this experience has taught all of us in the process?
Yep. Thank you very much. I mean, you're right. This scheme was designed during a time where Nepal was in a complete lockdown. Many enterprises were closed for weeks. Many people lost their jobs, and the country and larger parts of the world were reeling with a severe, public health crisis. So I think that's also why we pushed for collateral-free and interest-free loan mechanisms in this case. But you are right, like in normal times, if you will, or in a business as usual condition, the design would have taken a different route for sure. So this brings me to the question, or your question, of how can we sustainably address that MSME funding gap in Nepal. And I think the short answer to the question is through a target-oriented collaboration between the public and the private sector.
Thank you very much. I would like to come to Sumanji. You dealt with some 100 enterprises, and this being a very new concept. So what were the legal, procedural, and you're mentioning there was no regulator in our informal conversation. What kind of impediments you faced during the implementation of this from both supply and demand sides? So was there any policy constraints for you? Or when you think of expanding it, what kind of policy support you would like to see on it?
Thank you. The answer is not really. We did not come across real policy impediments. In fact, I mentioned about the interaction we had with the top brass of the central bank before putting it into motion. They were absolutely supportive. The only point they made was to avoid duplication, because there are other refinance programs that the central bank runs. These are, even during normal times, they just wanted to make sure that the same enterprise does not end up getting more than one concessional facility. So that was the only piece of advice we got. The rest was all encouragement.
I would like to again come to Mr. Dastidar. From your experience, how do you see the business integrity, recovery rate of investment on SMEs in Nepal? And there is one trend of, banks lending through another intermediary to meet their quota of deprived sector lending. So, as Mr. Joshi was mentioning, is there a possibility of leveraging that advantage of deprived sector funding, not going through additional logistical cost for the borrowers?
I love this question, and why I'll try and summarize what my co-speakers have. So while you were talking, I was thinking of a roadmap. So it's a bit of passion coming out. It may or may not happen. So Suman, not 3 to 5 years. So let me summarize a roadmap. And this is something we are talking to the regulator about. First and foremost, Nepal has a brilliant Industrial Enterprise Act. We are telling the regulator, please have a look, widen the base for MSMEs. MSMEs are the backbone of any economy. We know it in South Asia specifically. To your point, classification, whether the 2 million or 10 million needs to change. The base has to widen. Third, you have 28 A-class banks running after the same client. It doesn't make sense. A-class, B-class cooperatives change the participation model. And that's what we are telling. We would definitely, as large international banks or our big banks like Nabal, would love to participate. But is it in the same way, going and doing term lending like a B-class bank or a cooperative bank? We don't think so. So that's the third piece. I'm just giving the blocks and not getting into the detail. Fourth is blended finance comes in beautifully because then banks have an option to risk participate. It could be long tenor, it could be fee-based, it could be non-funded based. And MSMEs get an advantage of, and obviously, Suman, it is low risk. I totally agree with you. The impairments are benign, track record is great. We also need to sit with the regulator when we talk about regulations around collateralization. It is there in black and white. So that needs to happen. The other last 2 points, it might be a bit controversial. In most market, government also steps in, whether it's a ministry, as an equity partner. Most multilaterals, international investors want to see assurances. It comes in the form of guarantees or covers. There has to be some element of assurance. So government needs to step in as an equity partner. And the last bit, which I was thinking about is, Nepal, at least for our bank, is a basket case for sustainable finance and blended finance, given that where else in the world can you get clean energy, hydropower, and everything which comes around it, hence the SDG goals. I mean, this is the perfect country to push in blended finance. And that whole SDG goals, sustainable finance, net zero comes in beautifully, especially when the world is talking about climate now.
Thank you. May I now come to Dr. Marco? Do you think this is a replicable model? Whatever we have done here is a replicable model, and what is how SDC is thinking in terms of expanding its scope, particularly with regard to MSMEs?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the process of supporting the governments of Province 1 to design a project that is mobilizing a blended finance mechanism to support SME growth and also SME innovation in Province 1. And it also is linked to working with pre-loan and post-loan BDS. So yes, it's something we're pursuing.
May I come to Ms. Chandni? As Mr. Dastidar very diplomatically said, recovery is good if you find the right partner. So in case of MSMEs and others, how much do we need to make those partners better in terms of business development services, in terms of enabling them to manage the simple logistics of the businesses, in terms of managing finances? And where can the development partners, like the organization you work with, can contribute to part of the question? How important it is to make them first, how much do we need to work to make them the right kind of partners at the beginning?
Thank you. Yes, I think there is a role that development partners can play, and that is to bring that is to bring a blended finance structure. So I think the objective of a development partner to come into a fund like this is resource mobilization. We want to see how we can get the most impact for the smallest amount of fund that we can inject. So this is where concessionality comes in. We need to identify what is the level at which the market will function on its own and what is the kind of support that we can provide. Just like Mark has mentioned earlier, I think our role is to build the market and to then support players to come in and take the market forward. And I think development partners can play this role, and I think there are development partners like SDC, like FCDO, who are trying to play this role. I think one is on the capacity building of SMEs. I think that will help to unlock access to finance for them. But the other role that we can also play is creating blended finance funds that will be able to look at more risky investments, and maybe that could be something that Standard Chartered can also look at. Because I think banks also know that they can go out and reach the markets that they would like to, but maybe some sort of a fund that helps them to de-risk their investments would be helpful. And I think this is another place where development partners can play a role.
Finally, I would like to come to Mr. Joshi again. How do you think is replicable is this process, and is this level of trust of the banks and financial institutions enough to funnel the resources, particularly the collateral-free resources for SMEs? And if you want to bring on board the policymakers, the financiers, and the key stakeholders whom you are lending, what do you foresee on the basis of your experience and learning from the implementation of this fund?
Well, the answer to the first part of your question with respect to whether it's replicable, scalable, I think yes. By the way, we have recently launched the same program in Bangladesh, again, with the help of SDC. So it is certainly replicable. Scalable, it certainly is, we believe. SME finance in Nepal in the short to mid-term is a blended finance play. Let's bring these actors together, roll it out. We don't even need too much policy intervention here because the central bank already wants the financial services providers to cater to the SMEs. There's a financing gap of 3.6 billion, Chandni mentioned. I thought it was 4 billion and upwards, but that's a large, huge gap. And the issue about all these players running out of the same pie doesn't hold true if we can make them bankable. There is enough for everybody. $4 billion to be lent or $4 billion to be invested in. So why do we even need to compete? It's such a huge, huge market. So I think I'm probably the most optimistic person amongst the panel, but we've seen it work and we know that it can be done. With the right partnership and with the right intent, it can be done.
At the end, I would like to sum up in 3 points. Probably we are looking at the ecosystem approach that is mentioned even during the earlier sessions. All demand side, supply side, and particularly I like the concept, the fund management, one to watch, created a very effective bridge between the banks and the MSMEs. The fund was there with the bank, it is still there, I think. The MSMEs definitely needed fund. What needed was a credible bridge. So that is very important even to scale up, as Sumanji was saying. Thank you for very patient listening. And thank you very much for very valuable views, sharing experiences and contribution. Hope this will lead us to the next level of the thought process and redesigning this sort of financing problems of blended nature with much sophistication and implementability. Thank you very much.